I actually kind of became a little atheistic there for a second whenever I thought I was, knew it all and was smart at 14 years old. And whenever you study the history and what the Book of Mormon actually says about what Christ's church is, it seems to be more of a universal spiritual brotherhood, sisterhood sort of thing. Whomsoever is baptized and repents and takes on my name is my church. There is but two churches. Monson had recently died, and I walked into the church chapel and I saw a big picture of Nelson being hung up on the wall, and my stomach just instantly dropped into a pit. And I don't know why, or I didn't know why, but I just had to turn around and walk back out. There was something off.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to episode 23 of the Clarity Podcast. I'm your host, Claire, and this week's episode, we interviewed Chaz Walters. Chaz is from Arizona, and he has had quite the journey exploring mainstream Christianity when he was younger to atheism, and then later joining the LDS Church. And we're going to find out what happened to Chaz on his journey of learning the truth about the mainstream LDS Church. So stay tuned for all this and more on this week's episode of the Clarity Podcast. Everyone has a journey they are walking, and along that road, we are met with potholes, road bumps, rain, storms, and sometimes just fog. But through it all, we're really just looking for one thing: clarity. Clarity so we can walk with confidence in that next step. There's one source I run to for that clarity. In the darkest of nights, Jesus offers me light that shines through even the thickest storms. Welcome to the Clarity Podcast, where we find clarity through the one who saves us all. Hey, everybody, and welcome to episode 23 of the Clarity Podcast. I'm your host, Claire, and today's guest is Chaz Walters. Thank you so much, Chaz, for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we are so excited to have you and to hear your story. So if you guys have been listening to my podcast for quite some time, you know I get pretty excited when we get young people on here because we're such a unique space here where there aren't too many young people in this place, but there are some. And so when I find them, I want to tell their story. So let's go ahead and introduce yourself, Chaz, and tell our audience a little bit about who you are, how old you are, and where you're from.
Yeah, you already introduced me. I'm Chaz Walters. I'm 28 years old, born and raised in Buckeye, Arizona. Converted to the church in 2017. I have a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Studies and Global Sustainability from Northern Arizona University, minored in anthropology. And now I do real estate here in Arizona. We sell commercial, residential, land, you name it.
That's awesome. All right.
Yeah.
So let's jump into your childhood. We're going to start from the very beginning, like we do with every episode. Go ahead and tell us a little bit about what your childhood was like and what religion you were raised in, and a little bit about what that looked like when you were a kid.
Yeah. So my mom was pretty much raised LDS, or my grandparents converted whenever she was pretty young. And she was aware of the church and its teachings and stuff, not as in depth as she might have wished, but there was some cultural stuff that happened and some like kind of interpretations from her local community that kind of led her away from the church. But whenever I was growing up, she always taught me to have a personal relationship with Christ. And we visited the LDS Church every once in a while on Easter and everything, but I just didn't know any of the context. I just knew that I was there because my grandparents were there. And so I was around different Christian-esque atmospheres. She put me into a private school whenever I was in third grade, Christian private school. So we would have to memorize Bible verses and act out Old Testament stories. And I enjoyed all that. But I was always getting in trouble whenever I was a kid for asking too many questions, especially in that school. And the questions that I was asking kept getting harder and harder for the people that were in my environment. And so I had some experiences going to Christian Bible camp with some of the Baptists in my community and everything. And I had experiences with Jesus, but whenever it came to the theological conundrums that they were presenting to me in their worldview, it was off-putting. There was some real ethical questions that I had. And so went to Christian private schools, kind of in the youth groups at this local church and everything. Ultimately, high school came around and I just started to kind of question how foolproof this view was. And so I actually kind of became a little atheistic there for a second whenever I thought I was, knew it all and was smart at 14 years old. And at that time, my grandparents said, "Hey, we should have the missionaries come over and try and answer some of your questions, Chaz." So I think I was a freshman in high school. And I was like, "Yeah, go ahead." And so they invited the missionaries over for the first time. And I, being kind of the cocky kid that I was at that time, made a whole PowerPoint presentation on why Joseph Smith was a fraud and why the LDS Church was wrong. And yeah, so that was interesting. So the missionaries kind of showed up, and one of them was really calm and copacetic and was trying to understand where I was coming from, wherever the other one was like getting kind of frustrated, like, why are we even here? You know, it sounds like you already made up your mind, but little did he know there were some questions from the open-minded missionary. That I asked him some questions about the afterlife and how about people that have never heard about Jesus and all these other things. And he had some questions that I hadn't heard from any of my other Christian denominations. He had some answers that I'd never considered. And so I was kind of impressed, but nevertheless wasn't converted by that meeting. So they left. I had a Book of Mormon from that experience that was sitting on my shelf, but wasn't convinced. So I ended up studying. I had a spiritual desire in me, so I ended up looking for different answers. I started studying more Eastern schools of thought. Buddhism was really my thing, finishing out into high school. And then once I got into college, it kind of opened my worldview a little bit more because there's a whole bunch of like street preachers and different perspectives that are out there on college campuses. And so because my gung ho attitude with how smart I thought I was always just wanting to talk to all these guys to pick their brains and see how much they really thought through some of this stuff.
Actually, I'm going to stop you there. Let's
Yeah.
backtrack just a little bit.
All
So,
right.
tell us a little bit for context purposes about your questions when you were a kid, when you were a teenager. What were some of the questions that you were rolling around in your head that you maybe didn't feel like your religious leaders were answering for you?
So I had a lot of questions, but primarily it was about the nature of hell and who goes there, and is there potential? Is that ethical for you to punish someone for an unending amount of time for a very limited mistake? All sins are equal, in the eyes of God. If you lie, you're going there unless you just profess the name of Jesus. And the kind of once saved, always saved kind of perspective never really made sense to me in terms of, no, you don't actually have to perform on that claimed faith and everything. And free will was often something that I had a hard time wrapping my head around. How can an all-knowing God not know every decision that we're going to make before we make it? And if that is the case, then free will is an illusion. And so that framework it seemed just like it had gaping holes in it. And then later on, I discovered the LDS perspective on, no, hell isn't unending punishment. It is endless punishment, because endless is the name of the Lord and everything. And so it's not an unjustified consequence for your actions within the LDS point of view. I'm like, all right, that's kind of cool. And then with free will, that issue is solved whenever you recognize the eternal nature of our intelligence, the light that dwells in us. And so if that is one with God, has always existed, it was never created, then it is fundamentally one process. And so these are kind of airy-fairy kind of ideas, but they were important for me because I needed my logical side of my reasoning to be balanced in my heart-centered side as well. And so free will and hell, people who have never heard of Jesus going to hell, all these other things, those were the biggest issues that I had.
Yeah, well, you're hitting all of the points where there's a huge chasm between Christian doctrine and LDS doctrine. And I had no idea that there was such a big difference until I came out of the LDS organization and started talking to Christians, thinking that I had so much in common with Christians, and then realizing I had very little in common with Christians. And so I think you're hitting all of the really important points of topic there. So go ahead and continue your story. You were a little bit atheist. You met with these missionaries. You had a Book of Mormon. What happened next?
Yeah, I had a Book of Mormon, but still had a spiritual hunger. So I started studying Buddhism. And end of sophomore year, I came across a guy. He's a Hare Krishna. I don't know if you're aware of those guys. They kind of shave their head and they have a ponytail and they sing. They're kind of the Hindu-esque kind of guys, and they sing Hare Krishna and they got symbols on their hands. And but anyways, hey, this guy's out here. He put his whole life on the line for this school of thought. He's just chilling here in his garb on campus. And so I kind of talked to him a little bit about his experiences. And he travels around the United States going from college campus to college campus in his RV. And he spreads his book, his holy scripture, the Bhagavad Gita that he has. And so I had struck up a conversation with him, and he brought up some interesting perspectives. Bought a book from him, his Bhagavad Gita, and started reading it. And I was like, okay, I could see how someone would see this as wholesome and beneficial to society and everything. And it kind of reminded me of the missionaries for the LDS Church. Like, he's a missionary for his own thing. And so I was like, I wonder. One day I came down back to my house from up in Flagstaff, and I was like, I wonder what it would be like I considered his scripture. Let me consider the scripture that I was given years ago by the missionaries. So I opened up the Book of Mormon to the last chapter and read what Moroni had to say, and my heart was kind of stirred. I was kind of surprised because I had these preconceptions of who Joseph Smith was and what he was trying to do and everything. And I was surprised that I was like, wow, this is pretty good for a fraud. Like, I could see how people would fall for what he was saying. This is interesting. And so I closed the book, put it back on my bookshelf, and the very next day I was driving in Buckeye in 120-degree weather, and there's two missionaries walking on the Christian private school that I had gone to school to, and had all these questions, and all they kept telling me was, you just have to have faith. You just have to have faith. And I was like, what is faith? You got to explain this stuff. Like, you can't just say you just need to believe it. And so anyways, the school that I was going to, the two missionaries were walking in their full garb, 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and they were all sweating up a storm. And I was like, oh, I've never seen any missionaries walking in my town ever. So I pulled over, and they kind of flinched, and they were like, what's going on? And I was like, hey, do you guys want to ride? And they're like, yeah. And they got in, and they're like, we thought you were going to yell at us for walking on your church or something like that. I was like, no. And they got in. I took them to the dinner that they were going to go eat at, and I took it as a sign that I needed to investigate this a little bit more seriously, and invited them over for a couple more meetings. But in the meantime, my grandfather was in the hospital, and so I'm like, I'm going to read this whole book because this is some strange occurrences going on. And so I just sat there in the hospital next to my grandpa, who greatly valued the Book of Mormon and was one of the most Christ-like individuals I ever knew. And I was just being engrossed in it and really studying it out. And at that same time, my mom was buying me some literature that she thought that I would enjoy off of Amazon. And it had some of the more deep perspectives about what Joseph Smith was teaching about having a personal relationship with Christ. And it was just firing on all cylinders. I was like, holy cow, how has this been right under my nose this whole time? I don't even think my grandparents realized what they really have. They had an intuitive sense that it was something good, but in terms of how important it is, I could see why they were always trying to brag. Me and my cousins, they were like, you should go on a mission. We don't even know anything about the Book of Mormon or not baptized in the church. You should go on a mission. We'll give you our antique car if you go on a mission, and this and that. They're always trying to brag us. And so I was studying it out. 2 months later, I ended up getting baptized. The missionaries were like, you're the most easiest investigator we've ever had. We don't have to tell you to read. You're answering our questions that we have, because I started doing research online, going into all these rabbit holes. And so, yeah, I pretty much converted myself. I was just like, yeah, let's get this show on the road, and got baptized within 2 months. That was kind of an interesting process. Went in there, and one of the missionaries that I was talking to, he hadn't baptized anyone yet, so he was super nervous. And they didn't really fill up enough water in the baptismal font. And so they kind of dipped me once, and apparently my knee popped up. And so they're like, we need to do it again. My grandpa was one of the witnesses, and did it again. My knee popped up again, and I was like, all right, this is getting embarrassing. I'm going to have to go all the way under. And so I like stuck out my legs like this to go under the water. And so that was the third time. I guess I needed some extra dipping. But yeah, the third time I was completely submerged. And yeah, Then I was a part of the mainline LDS Church. Went up back to college. There was a institute right there in the middle of campus, and so that was very fulfilling to be in that atmosphere of open-minded young individuals that were in the church. But I had an experience whenever I got back from a presentation on some environmental issues. I decided to go into the institute, and Monson had recently died. And I walked into the church chapel and I saw a big picture of Nelson being hung up on the wall, and my stomach just instantly dropped into a pit. And I don't know why, or I didn't know why, but I just had to turn around and walk back out. There was something off with that whole scenario that I happened to walk into. And then I came back down, was still active in the church, but still had that uneasy feeling of what was going on. Then COVID hit, and we can get into that. But yeah, that's pretty much the synopsis of how I became converted.
Okay. All right. So let's backtrack a little bit again. So we all know that like one of the biggest issues with Christianity versus Mormonism is the Book of Mormon. Like you hand a Book of Mormon to a really devout Christian, they're going to pick the living daylights out of it. So what made you different? Like, what were you seeing in the Book of Mormon that brought light and life into your heart instead of nitpicking all the little things like we so often see the evangelical Christians doing?
Right. It's plain. Its language is very straightforward. Um, I had a lot of issues with the Old Testament, understanding how that worked whenever I was investigating all these questions that I had. And it seemed to really put a spotlight on the plan that God has set forth, and the role of Jesus Christ, and how he's been expected since the time of Adam. And that was one of the questions. What about all those people before Jesus Christ and everything? And so the Book of Mormon outlines that they were expecting the Messiah, from the very beginning, but it also outlines how there was plain and precious things lost within the context of the Bible, whether it was manipulated or whatever. And so just seeing the doctrine of Christ, the plainness of offering up a broken heart and contrite spirit and receiving a baptism of fire, and ascending up the mountain, trying to pierce the veil, and we're all called to be prophets and peacemakers. And it's so my whole goal whenever I was in college was, how can I help the most amount of people possible? How do we make things better? How do we do things differently on earth? And so whenever I was reading it, I was seeing the outlines of its whole goal is to try and make a society, make a people that is living in accordance with God's laws and God's ways. And that'll be the way that we'll be able to develop people with no poor among them, both spiritually and materially. And so I was greatly impressed with the outline that was setting forth. And but yeah, it was just saying what has happened in the Old Testament and New Testament, the visitations and ministrations of angels, going directly to God. That still happens. God continues to work that way. Why would God finish talking to his people? We should be expecting further records. So yeah, it was just overflowing with love. And my scientific brain, it actually has like formulas, if you know how to pay attention for it, how to exercise faith. And so that's the whole question that I was bringing up earlier. What is faith? And it very clearly outlines what the process is required for you to develop faith so that eventually it grows into knowledge. And that's what Joseph Smith was trying to achieve with his whole history. And so after knowing the Book of Mormon and understanding where the church was, I really started going into church history. And once you understood what Joseph taught, and that's the thing, it's like the Book of Mormon has a sealed portion to it, but the Book of Mormon will remain sealed if you don't have the right intention. The whole Book of Mormon will remain sealed. And so you could see a Christian open it up just to look for little things to try and nitpick it apart and everything. But that's kind of like whenever I was first researching, whenever the missionaries came over, I was just typing online, why is Mormonism wrong? And it'll show you all those little critiques and everything and all the little quotes and everything. But then you go, all right, you have to look at the whole context. You have to look at the history. You have to look at the lessons being taught around these things. And then the pieces start fitting together. And it's so much more comprehensive than any other system I've ever come across. It's just logical. It seems to reflect what we observe in the world. And so not only did it work on my heart, it worked on it stimulated my intellect a little bit. And then the people, you observe the people that are associated with the Book of Mormon, and they just have a certain light and sensitivity to the spirit. So all those things taken together, I'm like, these fruits seem to be good. So I'm going to go ahead and uh, experiment with faith and pray to God and see if these are true. And I did receive a confirmation that this is where I needed to be. And I wish I didn't. It would be a lot easier if I didn't receive that confirmation, man, because this is a stressful place to be in, especially me and you with where we've kind of arrived, where we have to fight against the mainline church for the testimony of Joseph Smith, which is a strange predicament to be in. But
Yeah, I don't think any of us saw it coming, especially as young people. We did not see it coming.
right.
So, tell me a little bit about your personal relationship with Christ and how the Book of Mormon strengthened your personal relationship and personal understanding of who Jesus Christ is to you and for you and in your life.
So the Book of Mormon and the D&C really expanded what Christ was, as well as the lectures on faith as well. That was really enlightening on the role of Christ as the prototype for the saved man. And whenever you read the Book of Mormon, and whenever he came and ministered to the Nephites, a lot of it was the same message. But what really stood out to me is the highest ideal that he set forth. He's like, it's good for you to desire to be with me forever, but the highest desire that I have is for you to have the desire to serve your fellow being for as long as possible. And so that fit right in line with my whole perspective on trying to help people as much as possible for as long as possible. And so it really puts you into the whole service mindset. And I think that was something that really stuck out to me, is that the Book of Mormon is showing that we need to be servant leaders like Christ. We have to be willing to get on our knees and wash one another's feet and minister to the sick and to associate with the drunkards and all these others to try and bring them to the light of Christ. And so, and then you hear all the visions, and that's what they are. The visions are step-by-step initiation instructions for how to pierce the veil and for you to have faith sufficient to see Christ face to face. And so you read Nephi's vision, Lehi's vision. You read in the book of Ether, especially, and that's one of my favorite books in the Book of Mormon, what it takes for you to have these direct experiences with the divine. And I won't go into too much detail, but from reading those depictions, I entered states where I know not whether I'm in the body or not. And once you have those experiences, you can't really go back, and I think that's why it's so important, because you have all these different denominations that they just listen to what they're told by Preacher Bob or whatever, or Preacher Bill. No offense to your dad, but but it's like, just because they graduated with a ministering degree from a non-denominational Christian college doesn't mean that they have all the answers. And so ultimately, for you to get the answers to your hard questions, you need to go directly to God. And that's what the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith was constantly telling us, is to go to God for divine learning yourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. There are two things. I always say there are two things that Christians and Mormons have in common, and that's their bad behaviors.
Absolutely. We all need to repent. That's for sure.
And so when we understand that we have to go to God to have that personal relationship and to get those questions answered, then we stop grinding against each other and treating each other badly to prove a point, essentially. And it sounds like this is kind of the journey that you were going through, especially in that sense of being more service minded, which is also a huge deal, because how many people do we know in churches that are the church people, the church leaders, but they don't actually care about other people? And that actually drove me crazy when I started to wake up to that and realize how how much of the scriptures do we actually live? And that's like what really started pinching my heart, was the desire to want to be like Christ instead of just talking about it on Sundays. So that's really important points that you're making there. So let's jump into COVID times. Describe to us what COVID did to you and kind of like what was going on in your head during the time and all the things that were happening in our world.
Yeah. So COVID was interesting. There was a lot of stuff going on. I wasn't too big of a fan of them shutting down churches, but you kind of heard the outpouring saying, hey, they got to do what they got to do because they're a global church and this is what you got to do. All right, fine, we'll go along with that. Um, People are talking on Facebook. I'm a part of some groups that are interested in some alternative news and everything. And so the earthquake happened during the beginning of COVID, and Moroni's trumpet fell out of his hand. And so there was a whole bunch of people talking about the LDS Church and what symbolism this is and this and that. And I was on there kind of defending the LDS Church, kind of from the patriotic Ezra Taft Benson kind of perspective of the white horse, and Mormon people will save the United States, but whenever its constitution is hanging on by a thread. And I didn't know too much of the context of that information. That's just kind of the vibe that was going around. So I'm sitting here kind of defending, and it's just a happenstance and everything. And COVID kept going on, and then the vaccines were announced. And I was like, well, hopefully if they don't denounce it, at least don't say anything for or against it. And they did the exact opposite of that. And they said, you need to get this. It's safe and effective. It's what we've been praying for. It's sent from God. And you're hearing these from servants from God that are saying they're the direct mouthpiece. And so I was like, whoa, this is not right. This is overstepping. Like, I can't even defend this institution anymore because they say that they're for the family, and they say they're for health, and they say they're for all these things. But then they're going to come out with such confidence and tell people to take an experimental RNA injection. And I was done. And so I went into my bishop and I said, hey, I think I'm going to not be going to this church so much. I've been entertaining other churches at this time. Never lost the testimony of the Book of Mormon. But as I was kind of gaining some information around the same time, I'm like, all right, then I really need to question this stuff. I had some inklings that Joseph Smith was a better man than we were being led on by the mainline narrative. And so it just kind of all nexus at one point. And so then I went really deep into what was really going on with Joseph Smith to try and figure out how we got into the position that we were now. And so I had a testimony of the Book of Mormon. I'm like, I'm pretty sure Joseph Smith is a monogamous. I'm going to the Eastern Orthodox Church, and I wanted a strong church, and so they didn't shut down for COVID at all, ever. And they were having police patrols outside of their church, and they didn't have any masks whenever you went into their services. And they were even doing the Eucharist with a common cup with one spoon for the whole congregation in the middle of COVID. And so that was, it might be a little gross or whatever, but they are like, we made it through the Black Plague. We'll be fine through this, right? And so, and they're saying it's sanctified and you can't get sick. They were fine. So take whatever you will from that. That whole congregation was fine through that whole ordeal. So they were willing and able to stand up. And I had studied ancient Eastern Orthodoxy in parallel while I was reading the Book of Mormon. And that was part of what encouraged my testimony in Joseph Smith. Like, there's no way this kid could get so much right, and even get it more right than anyone else at this young age and everything. There's just no way. And so I was like, I'm going to go here. Started worshiping with them, really enjoyed their liturgical, it's kind of like temple-esque ritual type worship. And so when I told my bishop this, he's like, all right, so what do you think we should do? I had my temple recommend at that time. And I was like, well, I mean, technically the handbook says I should probably not have my temple recommend anymore. And he's like, all right, I think that's a good judgment. And so I was like, here you go. Gave my temple recommend. And then I was off to the races. So then after that, I was hoping things would get better, but it seems to have gotten worse. And even now, the church isn't willing to acknowledge the mistakes that they've made and the consequences of the message that they put out. And now they say, well, we never commanded you to do it. It's like, dude, you came as close as you possibly could to be like, they pretty much said you need to get the vaccine. So whenever you just start seeing that, I felt kind of ashamed for the institution. I really wanted it to be the pillar against the world. And it seems as the World Health Organization, UN organizations, they just seem to be a good global citizen. They seem to be hopping headfirst into all these initiatives that are the world, the epitome of the world that we're supposed to be avoiding. And so I just didn't see a positive trajectory going on. So I said, all right, well, I need to start down this path on my own. If the church isn't going to help me, I need to try and figure out these questions that I have on my own. And so, yeah, I started Instagram in early 2020 and just started to see if I could garner some individuals that had some of the same perspectives that I had and the same questions that I had. And yeah, now we're here. Now we're talking with a whole bunch of individuals that have all kind of gone through a similar process whenever COVID went down. And now we're kind of a force to be reckoned with. I think we are actually accomplishing something, and I don't think the church would ever expect that. So I'm hopeful for the future, and I hope the church can change in accordance with whatever truth is revealed. I think there's a lot of inertia going on with the institution, and I don't know how long it will take for it to turn around, and if we'll be able to turn the big tanker around in time.
Yeah, for sure. So let's dive a little bit into church history and tell us a little bit about what you learned about church history. And, we have audience from all over, True Blue Mormon to the Pneumo movement to Christians. So tell us a little bit about mainstream Mormon belief when it comes to church history, and then kind of move into what you learned that may be different from what mainstream church is teaching.
Yeah, so the mainstream church, it teaches you that Joseph Smith was a prophet of the final dispensation and that he brought forth the Book of Mormon, and this is his testimony of it. Here's all the witnesses of the Book of Mormon. Here's their testimonies, and you should trust these testimonies, right? Joseph Smith was a great man. He made mistakes, but, God commanded him to do polygamy. He didn't want to, but he had to because an angel threatened to kill him if he wouldn't practice polygamy. And but he kept it a secret because of how dangerous it was to talk about such things at that time. And okay, that was the questions that I got, the answers I got whenever I was first investigating before I got baptized. All right, he was hesitant. What's that?
Did that put any red flags in your mind that you're like, what is this polygamy thing that they're trying to push here?
The most important thing is, well, they don't practice it now. From I'm kind of been around farms, and so I guess from a mathematical perspective, it could make sense and stuff. It's like one bull, a whole bunch of calves. It's hard to put it down to that way, but all right, mathematics, multiplication. But all right, at least we don't practice it now. I don't know too much about it, but oh well. It sounds like something that God permits sometimes. Look at the Old Testament. That's what they tell you to do, And I never had a testimony of Section 132 though. Whenever it was talking about, Emma and the voice in it, just didn't sound like any of the other scriptures I had read about it. But I honestly had to shut 132 the first time I read it. But ultimately, all this other good stuff was going on in my life and all these signs. So I was like, put it on the shelf, just like everyone else does, and we'll figure it out some other time. But as time went on and I started researching, and I saw a meme and it was showing the Saints book, the authorized narrative for church history, and it straight up says that Joseph Smith never had any public opinions on polygamy. But then as I was doing research, there was dozens and dozens of instances wherever he condemned polygamy outright. So right there, big red flag. Wait, I know there was instances now that he was condemning it. The biggest eye-opener was whenever John Hayek posted a photo of his original Doctrine and Covenants and showed Section 101, which was on marriage. And I said, what? This section is saying that we need to be married in public and that polygamy is comparable to adultery and our church does not practice it. I was like, how is this not day one information for the missionaries to explain the history of this issue? And when I found out the vast majority of LDS members are not aware that, one, he ever taught against it, did it publicly, like on dozens of occasions, was trying to publish it into the newspapers saying he wanted to root it out. And most importantly, it was canonized scripture. And they don't know any of this. And so I'm like, all right, COVID, this is like the way the narrative they're portraying is Joseph Smith is one of the most manipulative men in history, because he was like, so was Joseph just setting himself up for like a huge storm after this eventually got revealed, like he's like, no, we don't practice it. It's evil. It's adultery. It's from the devil. It's Satan. But the LDS narrative is like, well, he was eventually going to go public with it. It's like, he would have been killed then if he would have gone public because of how. And so you find out that a big chunk of the LDS members who went to Utah as well didn't even know that their leaders were practicing polygamy. And whenever they announced it at the Adobe Tabernacle in Salt Lake City, like 8 years after his death, like that was a big shocker to a lot of the pioneers that were in Utah. And I'm like, oh my gosh, how could you do this? They were starving, they were dying, they had an idea of what this was supposed to be, and they sacrificed everything for it. And then you're just gonna, once they're isolated, voice this onto them and then say it's required for their exaltation. I'm like, this is not good, and we have to address this. And we have to find out where this all started. Did it start with Joseph? Because if it started with Joseph, we need to question the whole restoration, because apparently that was bringing bad fruit all the way along the lines. And we've repented of some of that stuff with the foregoing the practice of polygamy and stuff. But they say, no, you need to question Joseph Smith's testimony. You know, he was lying for the Lord. And it's like, well, we can't. That's a sandy foundation you're sure setting up for everyone. And so once you put all these pieces together, it's like either Joseph Smith was telling the truth or Joseph Smith was lying. We know Brigham Young was lying because he lied about being anonymous in Nauvoo while Joseph was alive. But the question is, was Joseph Smith also lying? Was Emma also lying? Was Joseph Smith's sister also lying? Was Joseph Smith's mom also lying? You know, and so if everyone's lying, I don't know what to do. Like that's the perspective that the historians are putting forth. Brigham Young lied, all the apostles lied, Joseph Smith lied, all the Smiths lied. And yeah, you should be okay with that, right? And it's like, what? No, you're making Mormonism sound horrible. Like,
Which is why so many people think that Mormonism is horrible.
right. And so
Yeah.
it's like now I'm starting to tug the Joseph Smith was a good man. He was a prophet of God. No, he wasn't perfect, but he would not lie to such a degree on such an important issue as this. And so I'm tugging the rope in the direction of Joseph's testimony. I'm getting the anti-Mormons and the Christians and the Catholics pulling on the rope. And then I'm seeing the Mormons also pulling. It's like, no, he was definitely lying. And I'm like, don't you understand? But it's all founded on their authority claims. And I'm like, you don't have any authority if we can't trust the founder of of the restoration. Like, you're so worried about authority claims and you're so worried that God won't be able to work it out somehow that you're making people think that what Joseph was and is and what the Book of Mormon was and is the work of the devil. And I don't blame them. If your narrative is accurate, I would say they have good reason to think that this is not a good deal at all.
Yeah, definitely. It changes everything when you understand the history, and then you understand it's not just about, there are so many people that say that this happened way back when and it doesn't affect us now. But obviously it does, because we're now seeing the lies that are so loud that they're leaking into everything that we're doing in the church. And that's where we're seeing prophet worship, and we're seeing issues with tithing, and we're seeing issues with temples and all those things. And it's leaking into what we're doing right now. And so to just put it on a shelf, that's a little bit of a hard path to go once you start to wake up to these things. So describe to us a little bit about your spiritual life now and the things that you've learned and kind of where that takes you, and what does your life with Jesus look like now? You believe in the Book of Mormon, but you're not in the church. It's a little bit confusing for people who don't understand this position. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so whenever you study the history and what the Book of Mormon actually says about what Christ's church is, it seems to be more of a universal spiritual brotherhood, sisterhood sort of thing. And it's whomsoever is baptized and repents and takes on my name is my church. There is but two churches. And so it's kind of a Protestant-esque kind of approach that I've been doing. It's like we're kind of going back to the way ancient Christianity was, pre-creedal ancient Christianity. And so Joseph Smith was like, I don't want to throw out that old man for Arian and doctrine that looks too much like the Methodists. You know, it feels so good to be able to think and believe. It feels so good not to be trampled on. And so we need to accept all truth. We need to read the best books. And so I took that seriously. So I started reading all the best books throughout history that have seemed to influence humanity to the greatest degree so I can gain a better understanding of these things. And so as you read these things with the insight garnered from Joseph Smith, the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, it just comes in a whole different way. And so I do prayer every morning. I have a couple various prayers that I start my day off with. I often meet up in homes in various groups with people that take the sacrament and bless the bread and wine. And it's way more intimate. It's way less stale, way less corporate. Don't get me wrong. There's something nice to just be able to show up and just turn off your brain whenever you go to church, on the mainline thing. But I want to be engaged as well. And so whenever you're knee to knee with people in their house and they're telling you intimate things that's going on in their lives, it's a lot more fulfilling. And you can actually say, here's some money to help you with that issue directly. I'm going to give you money directly versus having to go through some corporate oligarchy that has to trickle it back down to the membership, and you have to get approval and all these other things. It's just direct on the ground service to one another and coordination. And that's how ancient Christianity was. It was done in households. It wasn't done in large, opulent structures. I mean, there might be a place for that, but it's not come as you are. You show up in whatever clothes you are, dressed in. It's not a fashion show. But ultimately, my relationship with Christ, it's like I said, it would be a lot easier if I was an LDS. You spend enough time in the arenas that I do online trying to fight the testimony of Joseph Smith. It could be discouraging, and it makes you question. I talk with some of these fundamentalists, and if you ever want to get your testimony in question, talk to a Mormon fundamentalist about these topics, because they're Brian Hales and all these other guys on crack cocaine whenever it comes to the way they portray Joseph and why he was lying and his supposed secret teachings and everything. And so I've gone through cycles of being discouraged, and maybe I need to keep things more simple and try to go to a Protestant church here and there, and then you try and come up with some question to make them consider their axioms from some of the stuff revealed through Joseph Smith, and they're like, I think we should stay on topic. And I'm like, all right, these guys, like whenever you're in Bible study and everything, it's like, all right, this isn't my crew. But yeah, I'm just constantly trying to learn more and more about truth in general and Jesus and how to reach more people, because ultimately I think Christ wants his whole family to be united on this earth. And so the more we can understand where we're all coming from, the more we can understand the ways in which we need to communicate so we can be of one heart and one mind. And so, yeah, I interact with people from all around and try and give my perspective and answer any questions that I have, and go to God whenever I have these crises in faith. But now I'm stronger than I ever have before, just because of how in depth I've been studying the Book of Mormon. I noticed that whenever I start getting too deep into church history and trying to win arguments and try and do that, I'm taking my perspective off Christ and what's most important. And instead of trying to be right, I should be doing what's right. And then that's whenever I feel the Spirit dwelling with me. And so that's the juggle that I've been doing recently. And I'm getting better and better at just letting things be online and not having to go all the way to the end, because ultimately we could be arguing till doomsday with some of these individuals because of how vested they are with the narrative. And I don't blame them. It's comfortable. Like I said, you could turn your brain off. Your family's happy with you. You won't have to be shunned. And so I don't blame them for not questioning these things. But for me, I got to get these questions answered, and they got to make sense, because if I'm not following truth wherever it may lead, I'm not being a good disciple. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and you're a testament to the fact that it's okay to ask questions. And when you're raised mainstream Mormon, the answer that you get from most of your leaders is, well, we don't really need to know the answers to those questions. And, well, we're not really supposed to ask those questions. And you know what? It's okay to ask questions. And if we really believe in an all-knowing God who loves us and wants what's best for us, wouldn't we believe that he's going to answer our questions? That's what life is all about.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So, all right, I want to jump a little bit about the conversation about authority. So you talked about how all these claims of authority, okay, but it sounds like you're in this middle ground where you're not really part of any particular group. So what are your views on authority, and where does our authority come from, and how do you kind of reconcile that in your mind?
Yeah, it comes from heaven, and that was the early teachings. And there's a lot of instances in the Book of Mormon where the existing church at the time, the institution at the time, had strayed, and there's been individuals that have gone into the wilderness and received authority from angels directly. I'm not going to say that I've had that experience or claim any type of authority. I think ultimately you can observe the fruits and the countenance of certain individuals that are filled with the light of Christ. And if they have faith to perform these laying on of hands and other things, if you feel called to do it, go ahead and do it, And I think that we may be receiving more messages in the future about the particularities of those things. But there's a lot of instances about like sealings and how that will work in the afterlife, especially whenever it relates to polygamy and all these other things. You have a lot of people with anxieties about, well, I don't want more than one wife. I don't want to share my husband with other people. Like, oh, don't worry about it. It'll be taken care of in the afterlife. And so if they're able to do that with those issues, I think that right now we're entering into a stage as a people of pneumos and remnant and all these people that are questioning the authority claims that we've been given. We're entering a period of the wilderness, and we're seeking the path forward. And hopefully that gets revealed here soon. But when it comes to authority, go where the Spirit leads you and learn how to use discernment. And especially whenever it comes, because whenever people see an opportunity to capitalize on an emotionally damaged group of individuals that feel like they've been taken advantage of or lied to, we have to be extremely cautious whenever it comes to wolves in sheep's clothing. And but ultimately, the lowdown of what a key is it's knowledge. And so you could be in a Melchizedek priest, but if you haven't been diligent in your scripture studies and you haven't been living up to the gospel standards and you haven't been seeking Christ and you're just doing it to do it, it's not going to have the same power of some guy in your home church that loves the Book of Mormon with all their heart and has been fasting and praying. Joseph Smith said you could, if there is no faith, you could it's pretty much, if you baptize someone with no faith, it's pretty much like baptizing a sack of sand. It's like it's worthless. And so knowledge and faith are interrelated at the deepest level. And so whenever it comes to authority, look for those who seem to be preaching Christ and his ways and how to receive him. But Joseph Smith also taught that any man that gains a little bit of authority is soon to exercise unrighteous dominion. So we need to not put one another on pedestals. We need to see each other as God sees us, as all equals. And I think that's the way forward. That's how we avoid the issues that we've brought forth in our modern day, is because we have put people above us and even put them as barriers between us and God, with temples and temple recommends, and you need to talk to your bishop, you need to do this. So yeah, I'm not too worried about the authority claims. If God can figure out all the polygamy stuff that everyone isn't worried about, and like I'm not capable of being sealed to my mom according to the Utah narrative because she's not married. And so does that mean we're going to be separated forever? Oh, don't worry about it. We'll get it figured out in the attorneys. And so it's like, well, why are you trying to pressure everyone into getting sealed and paying 10% of their income in the temple now? If it's not that big of a deal, we'll just figure it out later. And so whenever it comes to authority claims, seek the authority from heaven itself. I would say go to heaven and search out the scriptures and see what prophets have done before you. See what individuals who have had to deal with the church who has strayed, and see what God gives you, see what God presents to you, and see what God asks you to do. And I think if we all, as a community, were to have that approach to try and develop our prophetic capacities, then God will see us as a willing and able and receptive people, and we will have the path that we're supposed to go down revealed to us.
Yeah. Amen to that. Absolutely. So are your records in or out of the church currently?
They're in. Yeah. I've just been too busy to get the records out. Like I said, I kind of was aware of some of the issues whenever I came in. So, except for the extent that the polygamy thing was an issue. And so I was, I don't know, I might get my records removed, but it's just not been on the forefront of my mind right now. It's not, I was like, it kind of hurt, kind of stung with the whole COVID stuff, but I wasn't hurt to the extent where I'm like, give me all my records and all that other stuff, you know? So
Sure. Yeah, definitely. So what would you say to somebody who might give a criticism and say, "Well, it's important that we keep our records in the church because the church holds the keys." What would your response be to something like that?
I'd say I think the most important reason they want us to keep our records in the church is so that they can keep contacting us and messaging us every other week. But I'm not too worried about it. They told me not to worry about this other stuff. So um, I think God is merciful and just and fair, and He will have it work out. And so they can excommunicate me. I mean, I don't mind. Like, if you do it, I'm not afraid. I have faith sufficient to be okay. And yeah, I think we're making the same mistakes whenever we have this culture of exclusion and shunning. And they say it doesn't exist, but it does exist, you know, within the LDS culture. And and we're getting better compared to like the stories that my mom used to tell whenever she was a kid. It used to be pretty bad. It seems to be as a people we're getting better, but I'm not worried about it. You know, if they want to use my statistic to help their their projections. I don't care. We kind of understand the trajectory that things are happening, especially in Europe and stuff, with people leaving the church. And this polygamy issue is going to be an issue that has to be confronted here soon because it's gaining enough momentum where they keep ignoring it. It's just going to hit a critical point. We're seeing the drama going on with Michelle Stone's YouTube channel with the supposed subscribers being bought and everything, and she's almost upwards to 100,000 subscribers. And I think potentially someone may be buying subscribers for her page as a method to say, look, she's being deceptive. Don't pay attention to her, all these other things. Because anyone can do that. And, but if that number is accurate and her channel is upwards of 100,000 subscribers, um, we're going to have a huge voice coming up here soon, and they're going to have to confront this and either repent of it or dig their heels in even further. But we know the church doesn't like to be wrong, and if they do repent of it, it's going to be in some roundabout way wherever they just make a change in the manual or whatever overnight. But I hope that they do. Um, but I do think this is becoming a big, big issue, and a lot of people, we've gone through this years ago, and as we spread these messages, they're getting hit in the head with a sledgehammer like we were. Like, all right, this wasn't just like, oh, you didn't do your research. It's like we purposely left this out and told you something different than what actually happened. It's like it wasn't just a lazy learner prescription like some of the LDS leaders have said. It's like, no, we're very active, we're very vested, we're trying to find out as much information as we can. And whenever you have people like Michelle Stone who know the minutia of these issues more than the church's head scholars, it makes you go, okay, what is the church doing? Are they being purposely deceptive? Are they being just purposely ignorant? They just see it and they just turn their head. I don't know. These are the questions that the church is going to have to confront because this is, with the invention of the internet, this is a new conundrum they're being presented with.
Yeah, definitely. And it's very much influencing the members right now. And a lot of true blue Mormons that are definitely having these same questions and it's stumping them. They don't have answers. They don't have clarity to these things. And I think those are the things that people like us are trying to bring to the surface to say, look, there is clarity. It's out there. We just have to look for it and we have to go to God and ask Him. So tell me a little bit about your approach to groups now after you kind of experienced this. We all know that there's lots of different breakoff groups. We've had the Phil Davis group and Denver Snuffer and all these people. Tell me a little bit about your approach to groups and what your thoughts are on things like that as you're kind of in this new place in your life.
Yeah, like I said, I've been to a couple of Protestant, I've been to Eastern Orthodox. More recently, I've been attending the Catholic service. Um, And so whenever you read the Book of Mormon, it has this there are but two churches. And I cannot deny that there are good, holy people within all these institutions who have repented and taken on the name of Christ. And so the paradigm for me is just trying to find a group who harmonizes with my values in the very least, and ultimately shares as much of a paradigm as I do. So I've been going to Catholic services. I went to Denver Snuffer services there for a while and found their home meetings to be very educational and interesting because they're trying to really create a people that have that direct link to heaven and are seeking to be leader servants and everything. And so to kind of observe some of the how they handled some of their disagreements within those groups has been enlightening, and to see how they've been helping individuals. Oh, my daughter just got in a car accident. Well, we have this much in the pool that we've been gathering for our group. Do we agree? Are we going to help fund to repair their car? And they all vote on that. So that's been interesting. I really enjoyed reading Denver Snuffer's outlook on some of these historical matters as well as doctrinal matters. And it's been very enlightening. But I haven't committed to any group. The only group I've committed to has been the mainline LDS Church. So I'm still kind of waiting. I'm still kind of observing. I'm seeing what's going to arise and just trying to gather individuals around me that are willing to ask the questions and hopefully receive the answers in the meantime. So most of my spiritual interactions with a group have been online, various Zoom chats with Jacob Isabel and some of these other individuals. So that's where I get my spiritual nourishment. That's wherever I am able to talk about the topics that are at the forefront of my mind. But yeah, I'm not committed to any other group for the time being. I'm being cautious this time and not getting baptized 2 months after, first hearing about the invitation. So yeah, met you guys from online, and the whole group that you guys invited me to has been really enlightening, and I've been getting to know everyone and enjoying that. So, but
Yeah.
I worship at home with my mom a lot too. So I'll just bless the sacrament myself, and we'll sing a hymn and read a spiritual thought or commentary from one of the various books that we're reading, and then bless the sacrament and end it, and it just sets the tone right for the whole day.
That's awesome. That's
Yeah.
fantastic. I think everybody has to figure out what it looks like for them in the wilderness journey. And the cool thing is that we're all finding each other in these weird roundabout ways. We're finding each other, and we're seeing that God has led us all to the same thing. So, out of the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, okay, well, there's a lot of witnesses that are coming forth. And I think that's an amazing work that God is doing right now. Tell us a little bit about your Instagram page and kind of what you're doing there and what inspired you to start that. And tell us what the name of it is so people can find you on Instagram.
Yeah, it's Gnostic underscore mystic underscore Mormon on Instagram. And so whenever I was reading Joseph Smith and the things that he was putting forth, I saw that Mormonism was supposed to be an integrative theology. And Joseph Smith was the definition of a mystic, and he was trying to cultivate a church of mystics who had these transcendental experiences with God and were able to gain a direct link into the vision that God had for us and have the ministering of angels and everything. So I really took that to heart. And so I made this Instagram page that was going to gather in all truth and relate it to the gospel. And recently it's turned into why Joseph Smith was a monogamous Facebook page, because of once you get to a certain amount of eyeballs on your page, you start getting a lot of hate. And so I've been making that case recently, but ultimately that page is a place wherever I can put my spiritual thoughts and connections and just kind of have a repository of information for people that are looking to spread the gospel, to have some inspiration to go off of so that they could talk to as many people from as many backgrounds as possible. So we go into ancient patristics with some of the early church fathers to show how Joseph Smith agrees with some of them. We have Buddhist and Sikh and all kinds of different spiritual perspectives in there, and tying it into how that works with the Mormon worldview. But ultimately, I'm just trying to get that fire that Joseph Smith had and that enthusiasm that he had for all truth, and trying to bring whatever truth you have will only add to it. And so that's the type of attitude that was so appealing in the early church days. and why so many people were flocking to this, because it was a renaissance, a restoration of spiritual outpourings from heaven. So I'm just trying to teach people with that page how to become mystically minded, to seek out these blessings, not as a sign, not being a sign seeker, but if you receive these blessings, that means you are doing the right things. That means that your life is in accordance with what God wants it. So I'm just trying to have people fulfill their fullest potential. I don't know how good of a job I'm doing, but some people seem to find it interesting. So there's creativity on there with AI art, my creative outlet as well. But yeah, if you guys want to check it out, Gnostic Mormon Mystic on Instagram.
All right. We will definitely drop your Instagram handle in the description here. And I would definitely recommend that everybody go check out Chaz's channel because it has some pretty cool stuff on it. So I want to end this episode with the question that I ask everybody at the end of every episode, which is, after all that you've been through and all of this journey that you've been on, how do you find clarity in your life now?
Go to the scriptures. You definitely have to go to the scriptures and just read it out and study it out and be diligent. But prayer is what will bring that stillness whenever everything is being turbulent. Family members, whether they be LDS or non-LDS, are criticizing you. You have to find that stillness in God and know that He is. And the scriptures are the blueprint for how to find that stillness and how to be filled with the light that He wants us to be filled with. And I like to read, and reading is how I settle myself. And so I constantly read scriptures before I go to bed, whenever I wake up. And that seems to set my life on the right track for the day and have the correct trajectory that I need to have. But yeah, I don't know how to not sound basic. Read your scriptures and pray, and talk to your friends, I suppose, is the best way for you to be reminded of what this is all about and not to get lost in the wilderness that we find ourselves in, and to hold on to that iron rod, the straight and narrow path. And because there's a lot of good things that the LDS Church teaches in terms of values and outlooks and approaches towards life. But the main thing is just be yourself, be real, and ask Christ to show you the way, the next step, because that's all we can really worry about. We can have prophecies or visions of the future or the past, but for me, and the point in my journey, it's how do I get in my heart and how do I know what step to take next? Because you could have all the knowledge about history, church history, and what Nephi is saying, but if you're not living in accordance with God right now, it doesn't really matter at all.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I loved what you said about how the scriptures are our blueprint. When we read the scriptures and we know what they say, they are our blueprint to follow Christ, and one step at a time. One thing that God has put on my mind a lot lately is that my story isn't over yet. There is so much more, and that's the way it is for all of us. Everyone I bring on this podcast, everyone in the wilderness journey right now, our story isn't over, and we've got so much more to do, and God has a work for every single one of us. And so, super, super thankful for you coming on the podcast, Chaz, and sharing your story. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
If you guys are interested in joining us for an episode of the Clarity Podcast where you share your story of how you've left mainstream religion to follow Jesus Christ, feel free to reach out to me at clarity.podcast@gmail.com, or you can find me at forgedinhisfire.com, or you can find me on Facebook or Instagram at forgedinhisfire. Thank you so much for joining us on this week's episode of the Clarity Podcast.